I don't know if you've seen, but this sort of doom motto is hovering over your heads. The future will be profoundly strange. And I was thinking about that because when I think about the moment we're in and the future we must anticipate, I also believe it's going to be profoundly confrontational. Confrontational between private and public interests, the role of tech companies and democracy. Confrontational with a brewing storm over the Atlantic about 1 month before the inauguration of a very unconventional president, President Trump. But also confrontational when it comes to the core values, our freedoms, our democracies, our open societies. When we look at geopolitics, but also when we look at domestic developments, a lot of what I hold dearest has been under incredible pressure, and it's more confrontation than I ever hoped I'd see. And to a lot of this, there is a tech component, which I will touch upon. And I think for meeting the future that is confronting us with a lot of these core clashes and disruptions of the core foundations of our open societies, I couldn't think of a better group of people than you all and a better event than this event to think about what agenda is necessary to meet that confrontation with the moment that we're in, because it also presents tensions there to, on the one hand, preserve what we care about, what we don't want to see disrupted, and on the other hand, not to resort to some kind of conservatism, paralysis, and to keep having these exciting, optimistic points on the horizon that we can enthuse people to rally behind and that we can move towards to actually also embrace a better future and work towards that. But I'll come back to that. My most recent work over the past 5 years or so has dug into the question of how come we have seen so much capture of governance and decision-making by private tech companies and how that hurts democracy and the rule of law. So, for example, the massive outsourcing that has happened for so long has really made governments very dependent on tech companies. You probably heard the narrative, it's still going on to some extent, especially around AI now, that governments are not really meeting their obligations towards citizens, delivering optimal services, if they're not embracing digitization, if they're not stepping into the future by, digitizing, becoming smart governments, and so on. While, of course, we are learning more and more, and Steven mentioned it in his introductions, that there is no self-fulfilling prophecy and good outcomes of digitizing. And in fact, we are now being confronted with the fact that the outsourcing has also led to crippling dependencies, to security vulnerabilities, and to economic challenges for us on the European continent. And all of this research that I've been doing on the growing role of governing and decision-making by tech companies was before Elon Musk became the Trump whisperer that he now is. And it has really made clear for a lot of people what this problem really amounts to see such synergies between specific tech corporate interests from Silicon Valley, not only Elon Musk, but also cryptocurrency interests, for example, and the highest political office in the United States. And while there's a lot that we don't know that might be unpredictable about the Trump administration, there are some things that we do know, that we've heard people saying that I think we should really pause and ponder what our response should be. The vice president-elect in the United States, J.D. Vance, also backed for a long time by venture capitalists from Silicon Valley, hoping for a deregulatory agenda, has said that the US may put its commitment to NATO on the line if European lawmakers continue to regulate Elon Musk's platforms. I can hardly think of a more absurd and dangerous statement, but it has been made. And this is now the incoming Vice President of the United States. We see a number of other tech CEOs that are nervous for their past confrontations with President Trump. I'm thinking about Mark Zuckerberg and others making the pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago to try to become friends with him, be in good personal relationships, because that is how President Trump operates. It is hard to glance from all the different positions he's taken a principled political course. We do know a lot of it is personal, and that is also something that should give us pause. Elon Musk has been appointed, designated to be a key advisor of the to-be-created Department of Government Efficiency. And in the name of efficiency, a lot can happen. Efficiency may sound good, of course. Who loves a bureaucracy? No one. So good if we can scrap some unnecessary rules. But if you look at what some of the most faithful leaders in the Trump camp have been doing over the past 4 years, then in the name of efficiency, we can also imagine something that amounts more to a witch hunt, to a path of revenge of critics, and to very selective facilitating and cutting of government roles, which can have deep consequences also on issues like technology research, for example. So we've learned that the department that deals with foreign interference in elections at the State Department is probably not going to be funded going forward. But also, if I look in my academic circles in the United States, it's no secret that congressional hearings and lawsuits against researchers around disinformation over the past 4 years have really stifled a very important field. And that in and of itself is probably, a forebode of what is to come. But oftentimes, this relationship, this power grab, this big influence by Silicon Valley leaders in our politics and policy is not as visible as the bromance between Musk and Trump. It actually happens under the radar, much more invisibly. And I want to give you 4 examples of how tech companies have really acquired a lot of power, but of course only been able to do so because Democratic leaders have allowed that to happen and have essentially abdicated their responsibility. So please don't just take my words as a criticism to tech companies, which they are, but also on Democratic leaders who have not seen the systems challenge that the outsourcing of so many key functions to an increasingly powerful sector have amounted to, and how it's now beginning to threaten the very core of our democracies and our rule of law. So one way in which tech companies acquire power is really because they create technologies that lead to new realities. I'm thinking about a topic that I've spent way too much time on, really, spyware. So just because there are technologies that can enter into people's devices to compromise their communications, turn on their microphones, their cameras, see their contacts, et cetera, we have a fundamental challenge to the right to privacy, but also notions of source protection of journalists, for example. When I first started trying to tackle spyware, we're talking about roughly 15 years ago, around the Arab uprisings, we learned that dictators in the Middle East were using spyware to go after activists in Iran, Tunisia, Syria, Egypt. And we also learned that this technology was often made in Europe and exported without many restrictions. And perhaps to some, this seemed logical. Authoritarian regimes will use any tool to keep track of their people. But the boomerang has come back to Europe itself as well. We've seen the use of spyware that is sold here in the name of fighting terror, organized crime, used by the Hungarian government, Polish government, Greek government, Spanish government. So the fact that this technology exists and there are no guardrails around it, or insufficient guardrails around it, creates a new reality that really puts pressure on the rule of law. Another technology that creates such a new reality that challenges civil liberties is facial recognition software. So the fact that it is so ubiquitous and that more and more AI applications are being used despite the fact that they discriminate is, I think, quite remarkable, and a testimony to the fact that leaders are not taking their responsibilities, because non-discrimination principles are enshrined in most of our democratic constitutions, but they're not upheld when it comes to the tech context within which these rights are at stake, where there's hardly an AI application that does not discriminate, in one way or another, or that can prove different outcomes depending on ethnicity, for example, or criteria that really should not be leading to different treatment, like gender, for example. So the de facto change because technologies exist is one way in which companies have just become very powerful vis-a-vis democratic leaders. Another way is, of course, brutal market power. The market capitalization of the biggest tech companies is gigantic, especially when compared to the GDP or the economic power of countries these days. So if I take one example, Microsoft, and we plot its market cap against gross domestic product of countries, the company ranks between the GDP of Italy and France, roughly speaking. And if we take the 10 most capital resourced companies in the United States and put them together, then they together have a market cap that is the equivalent of the GDP of roughly the EU or China. And so it's enormous influence, obviously, because this capital and market cap is realized because of so many different products and services that we use in society. But also their bank accounts can buy a lot of things that are influential and that give these companies power, give them a leg up to become leaders in the AI space after having been big tech in other domains. So I'm thinking about hiring talent, acquiring data, compute, but also lobbying. Something we're all too familiar with here in Brussels, but it doesn't stop at the sort of fair game of knocking on doors and making an interest known. We also see funding of academia, funding of think tanks. CFG is really an exception there. Funding of civil society organizations, of conferences, but even the creation of civil society organizations. So it's safe to say that anyone who deals with tech policy or with tech topics and is in that civil society space will have a hard time finding spaces that are not sponsored in one way or another by tech companies. And so that market cap has impact in a variety of ways that really challenges the role of government. Another way, more invisible, but very, very impactful, that we see companies grabbing power is through the development of critical digital infrastructure. So undersea data cables as one example, or satellite internet connectivity as another example, where, of course, these companies need that infrastructure, but there is a huge vacuum in ensuring that our legal framework, our international agreements, are clear about who is responsible for protecting the cables, what happens when something goes wrong, what data is accessible to whom that goes over these cables, and so on and so forth. And with increased concern about geopolitical actors being keen to also see these cables as, a tool to have impact or to confront opponents, adversaries, we really have to double down on making sure that there is legal clarity and that we don't have companies pointing to governments saying, well, you guys were the ones that are supposed to protect our national security, and governments looking to companies saying, well, if you develop this infrastructure, you also need to make sure that it is secure. So this sort of blame game has to stop. The other example, of course, is the Starlink type of satellites that, on the one hand, create critical dependencies when it comes to internet connectivity, including in war zones or disaster-impacted zones, and give people like Elon Musk enormous power, or when it comes to image collection through satellites, for example, mean that there is information in the hands of companies that used to really be the exclusive domain of intelligence services. High resolution images from near Earth orbit down to the world can, on the one hand, inform better agriculture policies or smarter decisions with regard to resource use, but on the other hand can be clear in providing evidence, for example, around war crimes, the existence of mass graves, troop movements, and things like that. So incredibly sensitive information with key questions about who should have access and who do we want to be dependent upon. And then the last way in which companies can be incredibly powerful is because they seek the confrontation with lawmakers and regulators, sometimes in direct ways that I couldn't have even imagined. So when I was researching for my book, I learned of the way in which tech companies, when they bid for licenses for data centers, something that they all need, more and more data centers to house all those servers because of AI, because of crypto, because of our massive use of tech and the internet. When companies are bidding for land, electricity, water contracts, they almost always do so without revealing their true identity. So we already have an oversight challenge when part-time city councillors in, small towns, let's say in the middle of the Netherlands or Denmark or Germany or Ireland, have to weed through tens of thousands of pages that are well prepared by the best law firms, the best PR firms, the best consultants that are pitched, Silicon Valley style. And these people on a Tuesday and a Thursday evening have to sort of decide, is this a good idea or not? So that is a challenge in and of itself. But it becomes more challenging when you don't even know who's on the other end of the table. So in the Netherlands, for example, when Meta was bidding for a hyperscale data center, it did so under the name of Polder Networks. And only at the 11th hour did the city councillors figure out that this was actually Meta. And it's not just to point fingers at Facebook, although of course I don't mind either. But actually all big tech companies have done this, just hiding their identity also when it comes to the need for renewable energy. So imagine that there's a political decision to develop a wind park. That can be controversial. Not everybody likes the windmills, but people can swallow it when they think, well, then at least we'll have green electricity in our homes. But actually, that electricity will never come to the homes. The electricity will go to the data centers. And so another deficit that we see in the relationship between the way companies operate and the way democratic oversight can be done, this intransparent, sort of shrewd way of hiding motives and identities. And the last one, perhaps the most striking example that I've ever come across in this context, is that when I was a member of European Parliament in 2017, I was contacted through what was then called Twitter in a direct message by somebody who wanted to talk to me and who kept asking, can we talk in confidence? Can you promise me that you won't tell anyone what I would share with you? And I said, yes, of course. And it went back and forth a bit like this. Clearly, this person was anxious. And so ultimately, we planned a call on Signal. And I can now tell you what this person told me because it has been reported in the news later. This person was working at Uber and had seen how the company had developed a parallel software experience for what it thought were regulators and lawmakers. So the thinking was as follows. Uber's new services were challenging rules around taxis, the permits that they needed, the way in which they were disrupting cities. And so there was a lot of talk about, should it be banned? Do we need rules? And Uber must have thought, well, if oversight bodies or parliamentarians or law enforcement officials are able to experience our product as consumers, that may inform their view of whether or not we should be regulated. And so they thought, if somebody's trying to hail a ride in front of the European Parliament, or in front of Ofcom, or in front of the data protection regulator, or maybe the headquarters of police, then these will likely be people who work there. And so for those people, for those geo-fenced areas, they created a separate experience. So imagine you are stepping out of the European Parliament, as I would those days, and may have tried to get an Uber, and I would still see that little screen with those moving cars, where you're thinking, are they coming, are they coming? But for these regulators, that specially built app called Greyball actually meant that they were never going to get a car. And so ultimately, they would probably be discouraged, take a tram, take a conventional cab, go walking. But in any case, the people who would end up in this Greyball app would not have the same Uber experience as the average user. And that really gave me a moment to pause and think, wow, the length to which these companies would go to directly mislead regulators and lawmakers is, quite astonishing. So this is all just to say how dependent we have become on tech companies, large and small, in a variety of ways, for geopolitics as consumers, for our news menu that we see daily, really for our daily lives, our economies, and our national security. And that prompts a lot of important policy questions that I briefly want to touch upon before we're going to go to Q&A. First of all, the United States under Trump. What can we expect? Again, a lot is still unknown, but the deregulatory voices are very strong in the Trump camp and are also seen in appointments of heads of the SEC, the FTC, the key regulatory bodies of financial services, which impact crypto, or the FTC, which impacts anything from antitrust to consumer privacy regulations, for example. And that means that when it came to antitrust, but also when it came to AI, nascent rules, the US and the EU will probably be diverging. Where they were converging a bit under Biden and the past European Commission, there'll be a rift. And I think that rift can be quite confrontational. Because the way the Trump administration, the president himself, talks about trade barriers, combined with our extreme dependence on US tech companies, I'm not just talking about tech companies, but also US tech companies, can easily lead to the kinds of pressures in the spirit of the comments by the vice president-elect, combining security guarantees with trade interests and pressure on enforcement, for example. So the EU prides itself on being a super regulator, having adopted a series of important laws like the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, the AI Act, which are now entering into force. And I can well imagine that there will be pressure not to enforce very strictly or to, pause some important antitrust cases. And I hope to be wrong, but my hunch is that leaders in this town are quite sensitive to that. And we've already seen the political leaders of different member states in the EU rushing ahead to congratulate the president, emphasizing the special relationship that their country has with the United States. And so it's not only specific topics that we may see pressure around that will impact our ability to stand up our own tech policies, but also just the fragmentation between member states while being united in this world of more geopolitical tensions would be giving us the most strength and would be very, very important. So a combination of specific pressures and fragmentation is something that I worry about quite a bit. Now, on the European side, I can imagine that after so much ambitious regulation, the appetite is to focus more on implementation and enforcement. On the one hand, that's, I think, logical and fine. But of course, if there is reason to have rules for these emerging technologies like neurotech or biotech, there shouldn't be hesitation either. But when it comes to the EU's own challenges of staying competitive, doubling down on investments in the knowledge economy, really an articulation of the Draghi report, I still see a lot of tension between the large strategic goals of being more competitive, investing enormous amounts, unprecedented amounts, and an articulation of where those resources should go, to then also limit that crippling dependence on foreign, i.e. American tech companies. And so what I hope is that people like yourselves on a day like this can really think about, if we see these investments coming down the pipeline, what should they be invested in? What criteria do we want to see to have more transparency, to have more accountability, and a better reflection of what the EU needs, the public values that we want to see reflected in how technology plays a role in our societies, and to also think about loosening that dependence, weeding out that dependence over time. So what I actually hope will happen, and I'll end there, is that as a horizontal policy goal, almost like a lens through which all decisions are being viewed, that the goal of reclaiming the primacy of governance on the part of democratic governments is leading. And that can form anything from a public procurement decision today to long-term investments over the next decade, to regulation, to better enforcement, and everything in between. And this, of course, will have to happen at a time where there's more pressure on strengthening democracy already. So we need more ambition on the one hand, while respecting and appreciating that the context within which we have to be ambitious and tackle some of these unfortunate dependencies that have emerged over the past 2 decades or so will have to happen in a context that's harder, with more nationalism, so less appetite to work together on the EU level. Also, this fragmentation in terms of who wants to lean towards the United States, who's sensitive towards these pressures, or who just wants to make a different calculation for their countries. But certainly what we need is real critical thinking about some of the hype and the narrative that may actually be a repetition of past trends, that we need an uptake of AI no matter what, that Europe risks losing out if they don't do X, Y, and Z today. And I'm really happy to see you all here gathered today to have, a commitment to fact-based, research-based analysis of the role of technologies, which I really hope will inform tech policy, whether it is in investments, in enforcement, or in regulation here in the EU, while we have to confront these many, many challenges over the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marietje. Lots to think about, and we've actually had a flood of questions in already, so I'm going to get straight into them because we've got about 10 minutes for Q&A. So you got on to, at the end there, where Europe lies, and we heard a lot about the US, but one of the questions was, what is Europe's role sitting between the US and China when it comes to large technological developments, particularly on AI?
So my sense is that for a lot of countries, it is not entirely clear where they are exposed. So if I look at the country I know best, the Netherlands, I'm not sure that political leaders really know which sectors would stand to lose, where jobs are at stake, where there might be core strengths of our innovative companies, our universities, to really double down investing in, to create ecosystems around, to collaborate over borders, and to see a sort of, horizontal response, which I would ideally like to be European, but that takes into consideration these different sides of the equation. So obviously, the AI Act is a big thing that is being worked on in the EU, but essentially it only tackles, a small part of the way AI impacts our societies. It's about risk mitigation, that's important. But AI, for example, by nature, also challenges our regulatory process writ large. A lot of information is proprietary, so it's harder to know exactly what is going on within different models, different companies. It is highly individualized, so every person has a different experience, which makes oversight just from an operational point of view, a new challenge. And it's unpredictable, even by its own makers. And so what I think is also needed is a process by which regulation and oversight are innovated to meet the challenges of the technology. And I'm not seeing that yet. So I see a lot of sort of holding on to the AI Act as the answer of Europe at this moment in time. But we need much more, which will have to be targeted, including through investments and innovating the regulatory process itself.
Right. So that leads on to a theme that has come from many of these questions, which is Europe tends to interact with technologies through regulation, but not through necessarily investment or creating successful companies. People have named many. How do we flip that script from just relying on regulation to opening up to more interventions?
Yeah, well, I also want to be a little bit careful not to sort of embrace that reading of where Europe is too much. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of talent in Europe, and there's a lot of entrepreneurship in Europe. There is a challenge with access to capital, and that is usually why entrepreneurs will end up going to Silicon Valley. It's a unique ecosystem with a lot of venture capital, for example. And there's now also sort of outcome of the Draghi report, but a discussion that's been going on for decades, a lot of focus on the capital union. And so hopefully that will be something that can be realized so that any unnecessary barriers that do exist for entrepreneurs in Europe can be removed. But I don't think that there's something sort of profoundly European, either in our ability to be innovative and successful entrepreneurs, or in the regulators. It's a bit of a cliche, I think, that there's just so much regulation. First of all, the reasons why these laws are made are considerate. And for example, if we look at AI, if we do believe, no matter whether we are most concerned about existential threats from AI or the immediate threats to civil liberties, fraud, disinformation, and so on, that there are serious risks from this technology, then in the interest of companies and the trust in the product, regulation would actually not be such a bad idea. Because if a lot of people fear AI, which is actually how it's perceived by a lot of people, then having measures in place to balance out the risks or the concerns, to improve the models before they hit the market, to have a sense of what they might do, what the broader impact is before they're already out in society without any way to pause them, would actually be beneficial not just for the common good, for the public interest, but also for companies. So I think let's not fall for the cartoonesque description of Europe too much.
Love it. Okay, so slightly flipping that, do you see any applications of emerging technologies that could bolster state capacity, so that could be used by governments to be more efficient, for example?
I'm sure they're there. Just scanning through large volumes of information, for example, can help anyone from people in the government to people trying to hold that same government to account. So I think there's a lot of high potential technologies, and I'm actually excited about a number of innovations and technologies and what they can achieve, but I just don't think that it is principally right to do so in a way that doesn't have the kind of independent oversight and democratic guardrails where necessary. And that is where we've kind of lost track and where we need a course correction. But of course, we need to embrace all the exciting opportunities to improve the lives of people and the operating of governments.
Okay, and to come back to the profound strangeness, during your research, what was the most surprising or strangest thing that you discovered for your book?
Well, it's maybe not so strange, but just something that I feel like is the biggest, one of the biggest lost opportunities, is this notion that Western democracies would always be at the forefront, at the leading position with regard to the use of certain technologies, and that merited not putting up any regulation. And of course, this is a position that is now, very much challenged by China, if not today, then tomorrow. And the fact that there are no guardrails also means that the malign use by others that we could already see around the world, whether it's disinformation on social media, that of course had many manifestations before it hit home in the United States, or whether it is cybercrime or the use of spyware that first happened in those dictatorial contexts and then started to happen within democracies. We should have learned more of those lessons. The sort of superiority idea on the part of leaders in liberal democracies is something that struck me as a theme that I thought was very painful and that we saw many articulations of, and that I just hope we won't continue on that path.
Well, maybe not the nicest lesson to learn, but an important one. So I want to thank Marietje very much for her talk, and thank you everybody for your questions.
Thank you.
Yeah, round of applause. Thanks so much.